Hello there, hope you're well. If you haven't seen part 1 in this series, then do check it out. If you've watched them so far, you'll know that I've been reading out a series of stories from the philosophical magazine After Dinner Conversation, and then I've been going through the questions that they list at the end of their stories, giving my thoughts on them. But do check out episode 1 if you haven't, because in there I discuss the magazine more generally and give my thoughts on it. As per usual, I'll include a link to their website in the description, as well as a discount code that will give you 1 month's edition for free. So, without further ado, on to the story. Words of the Ancients by T. Lucas Earle. Praising what is lost makes the remembrance dear. Well, call him hither, we are reconciled, and the first view shall kill all repetition. Let him not ask our pardon. The nature of his great offence is dead, and deeper than oblivion we do bury the incensing relics of it. Ilian Shakespeare. Part 1. Kessler dreamt of his world freezing in the void, silent and lifeless. He awoke in a strange mood that morning, and climbed down from his house to watch the cattle sleep. They twitched and moaned in the half-light of dawn. It was comforting to him to know that even on this strange planet everyone dreamed, even the beasts. A villager quietly emerged from the mist and approached the sleeping cattle. He patted one of them until it awoke. He guided the creature out of the pen and gave Kessler a solemn nod as he walked it towards the slaughterhouse. The beast gazed at Kessler with dull eyes and did not look away until it disappeared into the mist. Kessler sighed and climbed back into his house. He couldn't bring himself to eat breakfast that morning. As the sun rose and the village came to life, Kessler stayed in his room, poring over glyphs, trying to decipher the language of the ancients, hoping to uncover the elusive past of this glorious planet. The hours slipped by until Kessler received word from a colleague that he was needed at a new excavation, located some distance from the village. He collected his tools and a few reference documents, then promptly jumped out the window. High above the forest bed, Kessler free fell for a moment before unfolding his wings and gliding through the forest, deftly dodging trees and branches. He alternated between gliding through the canopy and leaping along the forest bed until he reached his destination. The trees abruptly gave way to a grassy clearing. It was midday and the sun had burned away the morning mist. He shielded his eyes and looked up. A massive ruin stood before him, a long towering block leaning to one side, covered in vines, grey and crumbling in the hot sun, an ancient behemoth being wrestled to the ground, strangled by the foliage. Kessler approached the team of scientists congregated around the base of the monument. He recognized most of them from previous excavations. Hisson, the engineer, Kien, the archaeologist, accompanied by his team, and his friend and neighbor, Tiek, the resident xenobiologist, who noticed Kessler first and bobbed his head to greet him. Kessler bobbed back and approached the group. Kien's team busied themselves, setting up tents and unloading equipment from their vehicles. Tiek lifted his tail, affectionately swatting Kessler's side, as Kessler inspected the building closely. It was so weather-worn there was very little chance any glyphs were left intact on the structure, but Tiek seemed quite excited as he led Kessler into the ruins. They approached a long descending shaft, half bouncing, half gliding down it until they reached the bottom. This was the largest ruin Kessler had ever seen. They crawled through the tunnels dug by Kien and his team, before emerging into a chamber bursting with energy and motion. The commotion seemed to be focused around the far wall of the chamber, where there stood a strange blue and white metal panel flush with the chamber wall, edged with glowing fluorescent strips. Kessler had no idea what the object was, but he gathered it was something important. Kien explained that the panel was a door, and because the hatch was completely sealed, Kien speculated the chamber beyond was most likely airtight, perfectly preserved. Kien's team had found a geothermal power generator below the cavern. Whoever made this room had wanted it to stand the difficult test of time. Kessler approached the door with reverence. He hoped there would be some intact glyphs preserved within the chamber. Sesek, the engineer, was working with his team on severing the door's power supply in order to turn off the magnetic lock. Neither Tiek nor Kessler could contribute much to the procedure, so they crouched in the corner and attempted to contain their excitement. Whatever lay behind this door had been waiting a dozen lifetimes to be found. The panel slid into the wall, releasing a powerful gust of frigid air and bathing the cabin in a majestic white light. The group squinted into the chamber. They approached the door, carefully stepping into the room beyond. It was alive with mechanical equipment, blinking and pulsing. Its technology advanced, its purpose unknown. They proceeded through the sterile white chamber, wingtips twitching nervously, tails raised in alert. No one spoke. Through a side door, Kessler found a long room. Blocks of varying color were lined up in horizontal compartments along the wall. Kessler examined one cautiously, running his hands along its smooth surface. It was covered in unfamiliar glyphs. The object was topped with a hard flap. He pulled it back, and beneath it were thousands of glyphs on thin layers of parchment. The awe nearly toppled him. Each and every block on the wall was filled with glyphs. Each one was packed with knowledge, bursting with hidden histories. Tiek stood next to him, occasionally clicking, as Kessler inspected each layer of thin parchment. Tiek asked what the glyphs meant. Kessler told him he had no idea. Then Hussen's hand was on Kessler's shoulder, and he was being led to the entrance of another room where the engineers and architects were huddled, staring at rows of white pods. At first no one spoke, but every one of them knew what these pods were. The Riek had slept in them for centuries as they sailed through the stars from their old dying world to this vital new one. These were hibernation pods. There could be no doubt these pods were built by the ancients, and inside each pod was a creature, they presumed an ancient, with the answers to 1,000 questions. Hissen, Sesek, and Tiek spent the remaining daylight hours, and many of the sunless ones, examining the technological differences between these pods and the Riek's own. They began the cycling down process slowly with just one pod picked at random, so as to safely awaken its inhabitant. Most of the team slept in the cabin, where they could set up heating units without worrying about damaging the find. Kessler would not be separated from his work, so he slept in the hall of documents wrapped in layers of heated blankets. He had spent so much of his life digging through the faded remnants of an ancient language, and yet, surrounded by millions of glyphs, he felt suddenly out of his depth. What would these glyphs sound like spoken aloud? Would he even be able to hear the sounds? Perhaps the ancients communicated with frequencies the Riek could not perceive. Kessler's mind squirmed under the enormity of it all. He fell asleep with the irrational hope that the glyphs would somehow leak out from their bindings in the night and permeate his dreams, filling his mind with the wisdom of days long past. The next morning he immediately began to pore over the documents. He couldn't decipher the symbols yet, but they were familiar in their general design, if not pattern. He constantly referred to his notes, matching each glyph with a few intact glyphs from other finds. It was Tiek's chirp that finally broke his concentration. He was crouched at the doorway, explaining that the awakening process was starting. Kessler leapt up, still clutching the document he had been examining. Kessler watched, transfixed, as Hissen and Tiek slowly opened a pod. Strands of a gooey substance spilled out as the pod was pulled apart, leaving the creature within lying in a puddle at its base. The ancient monitoring equipment, as well as the Rieks, hummed, telling everyone that the creature was alive. As the last of the viscous substance ebbed away, a silence fell upon them. Of all the theories Kessler and his colleagues had debated about the ancient ones, this was the one they had never entertained. It was a cow. One of the scientists, an engineer, actually wagged his tail. Kessler saw the humor. That was, until the creature began to howl. It was a horrible, ear-splitting, sonic explosion, and while disorientation was not unexpected, given the recent awakening of the animal, it was still rather alarming. Quickly, Tieck and another biologist approached the animal with sedatives. The creature, though still sluggish, was surprisingly strong and managed to ram the other scientist, sending him tumbling into the far wall. But Tieck's syringe found a home in the beast's back, dropping it to the floor. The whole group of scientists pushed in while Tieck made sure it was not injured as it lay before them, breathing shallowly. It was not unconscious, only weakened. It was a female, but it was bigger than the other cows. Its face was longer and its eyes were larger, brighter, shockingly aware and terrified. And it was making noises. Noises unlike any they had ever heard a cow make. Tieck prepared more sedatives while Kessler listened to the incapacitated beast. The sounds it made involved a motion with its lips that Kessler had never seen before. Tieck swooped in with another syringe and crouched by the beast. But before he could level the syringe, Kessler's tail landed heavily across Tieck's chest. Kessler's wings spread protectively over the cow, and he screeched for his colleagues to stop. They retreated instantly and looked on as he dropped to all fours and looked into the beast's eyes. It was speaking. The other scientists fell silent and listened to the creature. It was undeniable. The sounds had repeating patterns. It wasn't mewling or whimpering like the other cattle. It was speaking. But how could a cow speak? They had been dwelling alongside the beasts for decades now, and the creature showed a pronounced lack of communicative or even cognitive skills. Yet there she lay, speaking, pleading with them. Then, without warning, she stopped and looked directly at Kessler, who was still clutching the ancient document to his chest. The two of them stared at each other for a moment, before Kessler, remembering his training, placed his hand on his head. "Kessler," he said, simply. The creature paused, then it placed a pale paw on its upper torso and uttered a single word. "Human." Kessler sat across from the cow and watched as she inspected the glyphs on the hibernation pods. She was refined, delicate even, for such a large and peculiarly proportioned animal. She opened a cubby and took out fabrics, which she wrapped around herself. She glanced at Kessler periodically as she went about investigating the pods. Cows couldn't understand the simplest tools. It was odd, even humorous, watching one operating advanced machinery. Kessler had persuaded the scientists to allow him to spend some time alone with the beast, to try to communicate without the distraction of others. So far, the plan seemed to be working. She spoke often, although Kessler couldn't understand what she was trying to communicate. He tried speaking back, but she understood nothing. Kessler tried pointing at objects in the room and saying their names, but she didn't respond. So instead he opened his bag where he had stored the documents he had been studying earlier and presented it to her. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she opened it and sat down on the floor. As she examined the glyphs, she wiped moisture from her eyes, and her breathing became quite laboured. Kessler cautiously approached her. She did not react. He crawled next to her and looked at the parchment she was inspecting. She lifted the thin sheet and moved it to the left. He observed her eye movements. She was clearly reading the glyphs from left to right. Finally, Kessler worked up the courage to point, first at one glyph, then another, and another. She looked at him, and he at her, his thin finger tapping the parchment. Then she spoke. "Words," she said. What a delightful sound she made! A bilabial! But of course she could, with prehensile lips. Kessler clicked with excitement. Kessler was overjoyed to discover that the symbols the ancient used were not glyphs at all, but phonemes. Each symbol did not represent a word, but instead a single meaningful sound. It made her language simple to write. All he had to do was learn all the corresponding sounds, which was easy enough once he found replacements for all the bilabials. He had finally figured out the tenses. The language actually had a means of conveying a future hypothetical situation that did not yet exist. The sophistication! When he, quite surprisingly, blacked out, it was in mid-sentence, and it was only for a brief moment, but in no time at all he was lying in Sarah's powerful arms. He shook his head and tried to stand up, but the room seemed to bend and wobble. Sarah made frantic sounds. "What's wrong?" she said. "I hath not eaten." His head ached. "Need food." "Food," she said. Kessler nodded. Kessler stood, Sarah hovering over him in case he fell again. He tried not to make eye contact as he crept on all fours to the floor. He tapped on the metal hatch a few times until it opened. Under the warm rays of sunlight, a bright-eyed young villager brought him food. The young attendant hummed pleasantly as she laid out an assortment of foods. Once she was done arranging the food in the proper ceremonial manner, the villager watched Kessler expectantly, waiting politely for him to eat. Kessler stared at the thin grey strips in the centre of the platter. Tieck and the other biologists came in daily to examine Sarah. They found that she was, for the most part, biologically identical to the beasts they ate. The differences were minute enough to be caused by simple mutation, an extra chromosome. "Let him not ask our Arden," they read together as they had done the days prior. Kessler had quickly unpacked the syntax of the language and was in the process of devouring its majestic contexts. "The nature of his great offence is dead," he went on, "and dearer than oblivion," she said. "Odilithian," he echoed poorly. "Or does it mean oblivion? Let me think." Kessler waited eagerly for the new concept. "It's where things go when they are lost forever." Kessler stared at the word. Thoughts of his freezing homeworld came to mind. A sharp rasping sound made him raise his head. Sarah coughed once again, and then she began to wheeze and clutch her chest. Kessler leapt to his feet, but, just as he was about to ask what was wrong, she collapsed. Kessler shouted for Tieck and the other biologists to come in. They crowded around, frantically trying to find something to do. Sarah grabbed Kessler and whispered, "My lung is filling." Kessler hushed the scientists. He relayed what Sarah had told him. They worked quickly and efficiently. Sarah moaned as they stuck the needle between her ribs. They pulled out a full vial of fluid. Kessler stood back as the biologist rushed about the room. He clutched his document. Hours later, when Sarah's condition was stable, he asked one of the biologists what was wrong with her. The biologist tried to find a diplomatic way of saying he didn't know. Kessler sat down next to Sarah. "I should tell you," her voice was weak. "I'm dying. You know that word?" Kessler shifted from one foot to the other, his claws clicking on the hard floor. "Odilithian?" Sarah waved at the rows of pods. "All the people, all the humans sleeping in this room, are all dying of the same disease. It's incurable. The disease will affect my brain. Then it will kill me." "Oh, why did not you tell I this before?" Kessler grasped at the words. "Because it was obvious you had never seen a human being until me. We must all be dead." Kessler said nothing. "That means that the cure was never found. There's nothing you can do." "We are scientists," he said. "Who have only had 2 months' worth of knowledge of human physiology," she said. "No, we have much knowledge," Kessler said before realizing the implications of his statement. Sarah stared at him, her eyes huge. "Kessler," she said, "is there something you are not telling me?" Kessler feigned confusion. "I do not understand." "What do you know?" Sarah grabbed Kessler's fragile arm. "We learned a lot in the time with you." Sarah squeezed Kessler's arm and Kessler winced. He was suddenly reminded how much stronger she was than he. She seemed to notice as well because she loosened her grasp. "Kessler, tell me," she said, "are there other humans outside this room?" "No, not like Sarah," Kessler chirped. "What do you mean, not like me?" she said. Kessler clicked incoherently. Sarah pulled hard on Kessler's arm. using him to lever herself up. "Not like," he murmured, trying not to fall over. Once she was sitting up, she took a painful breath. "Show me." Kessler took a step back. "Kessler," she said, "am I your prisoner? Am I trapped here?" "No, we do not. It is for thy safety." "Then you will not stop me from going up to the surface," she said. She was not asking. She gripped her rib cage as she stood. "I deserve to know." "I beg you," Kessler said, "lie down. Thou wilt hurt thyself." Sarah lay back, breathing heavy, laboured. Kessler's wings fluttered as he held her wrist. "I'll take thee in the morning." Part 2. Her stretcher was fitted to lines of cable and lifted up a long vertical shaft. Sarah recognized it as the elevator shaft that had led to the hibernation chamber under the ETI facilities. Sarah tried to focus on the streaks of light high above, where sunlight was waiting. Her small companion accompanied her on her ascent, clinging to the cable above her, watching her intently. His eyes in the gloom of the shaft looked like tiny pools of water. Despite their weeks together, she still could not read his expression. The glare of his eyes were dark, unfathomable, like a lizard's. Yet it was hard for her to think of Kessler as a lizard. His intellect was impressive, astounding even, and yet he displayed such simple compassion for her. Shakespeare had been an apt primer for his understanding of humanity. Kessler's colleagues climbed the walls, their skins shimmering, beaks clicking, long tails twitching. They seemed unable to hold still, yet, despite their unreadable black eyes and greenish scales, they watched her in a way she instinctively recognized. They observed her like scientists, with deep interest, but without judgment. It was familiar, comforting. She shielded her eyes as she was carried out of the ruins of her research building. The oppressive muggy air wrapped around her. She winced when a greyish alien with a red sash and several medical bags adjusted the tubes running from her chest. This alien had been looking after her medical needs since she awoke. Knowing the disease that infected her, she did not envy him. As the group crested a hill, Sarah saw the landscape of what had once been her city. She recognized none of it. The world of concrete and glass, asphalt and plastic had been completely swallowed. Everything was green, overwhelming, deep, powerful green. She would never have believed this was Miami, if not for the rusted remains of the Carnegie Research Center, jammed into the earth like a broken knife. She tried to locate the remnants of the stadium and the College of Medicine, but they were gone. Miami Beach was nowhere to be seen, swallowed by the sea. She imagined much of Florida was now underwater. As they bore her through the forest, Sarah stared up at the forest canopy. She noticed a large, dull orange bulb wrapped around the thick trunk of a tree. An alien emerged from a hatch in the side and glided through the trees. Other aliens climbed out of the bulbs to watch the arriving procession. Some of them circled above her. Kessler, always protective, hissed at them, his wings spreading, and they scattered, scrambling up into the canopy. Kessler led the group to the only structure that was built on the ground. Unlike the bulbs, it was large, spacious, made of wooden planks. Sarah's stretcher was gently placed beside it, as an alien with a medical pack examined her. Sarah watched Kessler's animated yet hushed conversation with another scientist. Their short, delicate arms hung limply by their sides as they spoke, but their tails whipped about in a frenzy. Sarah couldn't pick out any of the words, but it looked as if they were arguing. Finally, Kessler broke off the conversation with a swat of his tail and approached Sarah. "What's happening?" she asked. "Thou deservest to know," he said. "Remember, I will not hurt thee. Dost thou understand?" Sarah held on to Kessler's hand as the aliens lifted her stretcher. The doors opened, and she finally saw what Kessler had been keeping from her. The building was a barn, filled with stalls. Each stall floor was lined with hay, and each resident was staring at her, dull-eyed, uncomprehending. "Oh my God!" Sarah struggled to sit up. "They're still alive! Put me down." They lowered her stretcher onto the straw. "Bring one of them here." Kessler opened the stall gate and guided the girl to her side. Sarah touched her round face gently, examining her small almond-shaped eyes, her tiny ears. She put her head to the girl's chest, checked her hands. "She's showing signs," she murmured to herself. "How old is she?" Kessler spoke with the greyish alien for a moment. 18 years, he said. She checked the girl's nails. "This is remarkable. She has the disease, but it's not killing her." She looked over at Kessler. "Can they speak?" Kessler shook his head. "No. We are sorry. We did not know." "Well, how could you?" she said, absorbed by this new discovery. "She is showing signs of the later stages of the disease, but for some reason she isn't dying. Do you see?" "She hath sickness?" "Yes. She must possess some genetic mutation that somehow keeps her alive even after contracting the virus. There is massive cognitive damage, but do you see what this means? It means that there is a way to resist the disease." "They all hath sickness?" "They all have the disease. It's teratogenic. It transfers to the children. That's why they all have it. But they don't die of it." Kessler said nothing. Sarah noticed the silence that had fallen over the other scientists. "This is a major breakthrough," she said. "I worked to cure the disease for years, but I never found a single person who survived. Now that I have, I can solve this. And if not, there are dozens of other scientists in those pods who have devoted their lives to—" The alien seemed to be shivering. There was something she was not seeing. She looked into Kessler's fathomless black eyes for some sign. Then a horrible thought came to her. "Why are they in stalls?" she demanded. "We didn't know. A hen Rick travelled here. Rick took food with us. Old Earle food. Our food did not last. Rick landed with no food. Rick starving." Sarah covered her ears. She imagined the herds of humans. After the pandemic, with no language, no society, they had probably scavenged for berries, small animals. They had survived here in Florida, where the winters were mild. And to the aliens they would have seemed just like any other animal. And then she remembered all the times Kessler had excused himself to eat. "Why us?" Sarah frantically looked from one black-eyed lizard to the next. I do not know this word." Kessler opened his bag. He took out his notebook and began flipping through it. He opened and closed his beak. Finally he gave up and pointed at his beak, then made a line down to his stomach. "Digestion," she said. "Digestion," Kessler said. "For us to digestion any of the food on this world hath to eat." "I get it. You have an incomplete set of enzymes. But why us?" Sarah was beginning to wheeze. "We are made of the same proteins as every other species on this planet. Why people?" Kessler shifted from one foot to the other. "Not all. Riek only eat the—" He began chirping and clicking to the other scientists. One of the aliens pointed at his own head, and Sarah suddenly understood. The muscle tissue was the same, but the brain tissue was not. "You eat our—" She couldn't finish the sentence. She suddenly noticed Kessler's serrated teeth. "Kessler," she said very softly. "Can everyone go?" Kessler hissed at the others, and they quickly shuffled out. He turned and gave Sarah one last mournful look before leaving as well. Alone, Sarah looked at the faces of her fellow survivors. They approached her cautiously, like curious puppies. A young boy sank to his knees by Sarah's side and leaned against her. Sarah stroked his head, and his shoulders drooped, his eyes closed. She patted him gently as the others slowly congregated around her, gingerly laying themselves at her feet. The following morning, a group of aliens came into the barn, checked her vitals, shone lights into her eyes. She repeated Kessler's name until they brought him, along with the grey alien. I've been thinking all night, and I believe I have some understanding of the problem we face. Kessler stood quietly while she spoke. She had never seen him so still. I understand that to be able to digest any food on this world, you must also eat. She took a breath. You must also eat the human brain. Kessler nodded. And I think I know why, she said. The disease that killed my people is very similar to Kuru. It's caused by a prion, which is a type of protein. You may not understand any of this, but what I'm saying is that the reason you have to eat us is because of the disease. You're actually eating the disease itself. A healthy human brain would not provide you the necessary protein, and you would all starve. Kessler and the other alien fell into a hurried conversation of clicks and hisses. I understand that you couldn't have known, she said. I know how you must feel. To you, we were just beasts. Kessler drew close, his head bobbing up and down. The other alien clicked. Kessler translated. Can you cure the sickness? Sarah nodded. I can. We can keep you alive and in health for a long time, and you can cure the sickness. You would let me do that? She asked. Kessler and his colleagues clicked for a moment. Of course. Kessler, if I cure all the humans, then what would become of your people? You will starve. You could just cure some of the humans, Kessler said, and we could still have food. But Sarah was already shaking her head. We can't have a world where your people eat mine. We couldn't live with that. You couldn't live with that. We have scientists. So do you, Kessler said. We could remove the prion. The prion cannot survive outside the human brain. There is absolutely no way to remove it. But even as she spoke, Sarah began to formulate theories. Maybe she could grow the prion in another mammal. With enough time, if they woke up the other scientists, maybe she could find a way. But she knew what would happen next. Her people, would kill every last alien. She could clearly imagine how they would justify the genocide after seeing barns like this one. It was a dilemma with no solution. The fate of her people was now inextricably bound to the fate of the aliens, and it seemed neither could live while the other existed. Leaves rustled in the wind. She thought of the world before she had fallen asleep hundreds of years ago. Before humans had made diseases into weapons so effective that the only survivors could hardly be called human at all. Before they had made the prion. The solution settled upon her. It was so much simpler than she could have imagined. Kessler, I want you to put me back to sleep. When shall I awake you? Don't wake me, she said. She was shivering and her heart was pounding in her chest, but she had never been so sure of anything in her life. Don't ever wake any of us. The procession back to the hibernation chamber began at dawn the next day. A long line of scientists, headed by Sarah on her stretcher, they brought her through the woods. She sometimes saw a corner of concrete, a metal shard, rusted and corroded, the last remnants of the human world. When they arrived at the clearing where Sarah's people slept below the earth, Kessler crouched by her stretcher. It is wrong, he said. This is your world. Not any more, she said. What will I do without thee? We're not dead, we're just asleep, she said. She touched Kessler's cool, ablated face, then nodded to the other scientists to take her below. They brought her to the room with the other pods, and they put her to sleep with her brothers and sisters. Part 3. Kessler sat in the cave before the blue and white door, clutching one of the human documents. The other scientists were on the surface discussing what to do next. He knew they would choose wisely. He looked at the document and fixed his eyes on a single letter. Alone it meant nothing. He could not even pronounce it. But surrounded by all the other letters on the page, its meaning was so overwhelming that he could not breathe. He could not breathe. And that brings the story to a close. Well, that's a rather sad story, isn't it? So the questions are: 1. How do you know if an animal is dumb enough to be food? What, if any, test or question would you give it? 2. The doctor shows the newly awakened person a book. The person looks at it and begins to cry. What book did you imagine it was, and why? Would any book have made her cry? 3. At what point in the story was the right time to tell the woman she was nearly biologically identical to the animals they ate, if ever? 4. Who has the greater right to live, the sleeping ancients or the new residents? What is the best way to decide who rules the planet? Does a species have a natural right to preserve its existence to the detriment of another species? 5. What would happen, or how long should they wait, before waking another ancient, if at all? So those are the questions that the editors give. So going through them now, I'm going to focus just on the first question and fourth question, because I'm not convinced that 2 and 3 are so interesting, and I may weigh in very briefly on 5, and I'm going to focus mostly on 1 and 4. So the first question: how do you know if an animal is dumb enough to be food? What, if any, test or question would you give it? So I've actually got a video that peripherally relates to this. It's a talk I gave at St. Mary's University at a conference on transhumanism hosted by the Centre for Bioethics and Emerging Technology and the Scottish Council on Human Bioethics. And in that conference, we were exploring the ethical, philosophical, and theological issues raised by the possibility of transhumans and posthumans. And my contribution was to examine what it is that makes us human, and thus whether transhumans and posthumans would be one of us, or whether they would be a distinct species. And ultimately, I argued that they will be or are one of us. Transhumans and posthumans, despite the name, are basically human beings just like us, and their moral worth is the same as ours, and so on and so forth. And the way I justify that claim, one of the steps I take, is to distinguish between humans and animals, or non-rational animals. Because, of course, humans are animals, so the difference is what's different between humans and non-rational animals. And I suggest that there isn't any single test or question that would allow us to distinguish whether something is merely an animal as opposed to a person. I suggest that you've got to examine the entirety of the animal and the way it behaves. It's not just what it does, but it's how it does it. And so does it do those things in a conscious, rational, self-aware kind of way? And ultimately, I argue that it's rationality that distinguishes us from animals, and the rationality is demonstrated not through any particular act, but through engaging in acts with a degree of what we might call self-awareness, intentionality, consciousness, so on and so forth. And so you'd examine the creature as a whole, and if it behaved in that way, then you could infer that it is either rational or irrational. And if it's rational, you can't eat it because it's a person, it's one of us. And if it's irrational, then it's merely, in inverted commas, an animal, and potentially you could then eat it. So that was my answer, and I think that nicely answers question 1. So I'll include a link to that video if you're interested in watching it. It's fairly long and fairly technical, but if you want to watch it, then please do, and let me know what you think of it. So next, on to question 4. Who has the greater right to live, the sleeping ancients or the new residents? What is the best way to decide who rules the planet? Does a species have a natural right to preserve its existence to the detriment of another species? So obviously this question comes in 3 parts. I think the middle part, what is the best way to decide who rules the planet? I don't think that's a very good question. I don't think that's very well phrased, because it's not a question of who rules the planet. It's a question of what is the right thing to do in this situation. So focusing on the other 2 parts, the other 2 questions, I'll start with the third question first. Does a species have a natural right to preserve its existence to the detriment of another species? And my answer to this is it depends on the species in question. If the species is a rational, self-aware species, a species made up of persons, and we might want to call them human beings, we might want to call them people, we might want to call them rational animals, call them what you will. But if it's a species that's like us, then no, we don't have a natural right to preserve our existence at their expense, or vice versa, because we're the same sort of thing fundamentally. And so, in a sense, we're attacking our own. They just look different to us. So these aliens, if we attack them, we're attacking ourselves in a way, and these aliens, if they attack us in a way, they're attacking themselves, because we share, whatever you want to call it, personhood, rationality, self-awareness, and so on and so forth. For an irrational species, so actual cattle, actual cows, for example, pigs, sheep, chickens, so on and so forth, then whilst I'm absolutely open to the importance of animal welfare and to some extent animal rights, not abusing them and minimizing their suffering, human needs as people, as self-aware, rational creatures, our needs come first. And so, although we should do what we can to help them and to minimize their suffering, if it's a choice between us and them, the answer is us. And so, if we need to eat them to survive, well, then it's okay to eat them. And so, that kind of gives you my answer to the first question, or the first part: who has the greater right to live, the sleeping ancients or the new residents? The answer is they both have an equal right. More relevantly, however, neither has the right to exploit or to kill or to hurt the other species to benefit themselves. So I think that the aliens don't have the right to kill the, in inverted commas, cattle, i.e. the human beings, to feed themselves, even if the cost of that is ultimately the risk of starving. Just because I might starve doesn't mean I have the right to kill you, and vice versa. And again, we've all heard of stories of people, for example, getting stranded, on desert islands or up in the wilderness, and so on and so forth. And then the question of cannibalism raises itself. And whilst I'm, at least in principle, happy to have a conversation, I don't know what I think, but I'm happy to have a conversation about if the person's already dead, whether it's okay to eat them. You don't have the right to murder them and then eat them, because that's murder. And they have the right to live just as much as you do. And so if you've got to starve, then you've got to starve. I mean, there's no choice. It doesn't make murder permissible. Murder's impermissible. So that, to me, seems relatively straightforward. I guess the response that some people might make is that the, in inverted commas, cattle, or the humans, aren't self-aware. They aren't rational. So are they still one of us? Maybe they are on a moral par with real cattle, with cows. And I guess my answer to that is that they are still one of us. They are just severely brain damaged, ill, sick, diseased individuals of our kind. And I don't think that being sick, diseased, or brain damaged in any way affects your moral worth. Those who suffer from brain injuries or genetic disorders that cause, learning disability, severe learning disability, they're not less morally valuable as a result of those diseases or conditions. They are one of us. And so even though they're not operating as they should, none of that reduces their moral value. And so the, in inverted commas, cattle, the human beings, the children on that planet in this story still have the same moral value that regular humans have, and thus the same moral value that the aliens have. And as I said previously, therefore the aliens do not have the right to murder them to feed themselves. Now, obviously, up until that point, the aliens were acting in ignorance, and so they're not morally culpable for their actions. But once they know, well, then, yeah, they need to stop killing and eating the human beings, even if they are severely brain damaged. Now, obviously, this is really demanding. It's asking a lot of the aliens. We're asking them in the name of morality to risk starvation. But I would make a few responses. The first response is that morality can be demanding. And the second response is that in the real world, and I think even in this story, there were and are potential solutions that at least offer hope, even if they wouldn't have come to anything. If the human scientists and the alien scientists got together, maybe they could have found a scientific solution. Now, perhaps for the sake of the story, we should imagine that that was never going to happen, and so it really was a black and white choice, in which case, again, I'd fall back on my basic answer, which is that morality is demanding. And in a sense, there are worse things than dying. Losing your soul, so to speak, becoming evil, so to speak, is much worse than dying. And it's better to die a good person than to live as an evil person. And so my advice to those aliens would be stop eating the cattle, the human beings. Wake up the other scientists, call a big conference, and let's see if we can find a scientific solution to this. And if not, then let's, remember their sacrifice and thank them and honor them as brave individuals. Now, in the real world, would they have done this? Would any real individuals do this? Well, certainly human beings, who exist on this planet are unlikely to be that selfless. That's true, but I think that just shows that we're not always very good people. But I think that is what morality demands. Morality is tough, and sometimes, we're never really going to live up to it because we're all imperfect, but we should always strive to be as good as possible. And I think that that's what morality demands in this situation. So I think that's my answer to question number 4. With regard to question 5, what should happen or how long should they wait before waking another ancient living pool? I've kind of already answered that. I think they should wake them all up and try and find a solution by working together. I guess if they have chosen this course of action, then I think they should still try and do research, see if they can find a scientific solution, and then they can wake up the ancients. If you're going to pick a bad option, then at least try and mitigate it by trying to find a scientific solution, as quickly as possible. So I think that would be my answer to question number 5. Anyway, I think that's it for these questions and for this story, and at least for now, that's it for this series on after dinner conversation. I hope you've enjoyed the stories. As per usual, do check out the link in the description. Do check out the discount code. Enter that and you'll get 1 month free subscription, so you've got nothing to lose. Go and check them out, read some of their stories, and I'm confident you'll be impressed. For now, that's it for this series. If you really enjoy it and you want me to do more, then let me know in the comments, and maybe come Christmas time or sometime next year, I can get back in contact with them and arrange a second series or some other form of collaboration. Either way, I hope you've enjoyed this story, and I'll look forward to seeing you in my next video. Take care. Goodbye.